So in this type of stage magic, you see card tricks, you see coin magic, you see what people call close magic. I know a couple of the professional magicians I know call close magic is just magic that you're doing with just like you and somebody else. You're really close. You're not on a stage. So these are really high technique things of illusions and feints and sleights with your hands, usually using some form of misdirection. All right, then you also have illusions, especially appearances and disappearances. So making something appear and disappear on the stage. The illusions of doing something that should be impossible, like cutting a woman in half, as we see here, which is a classic sort of stage magic trick. You can see so many of these stage magicians out there in Las Vegas. When I was younger, there was a magician named David Copperfield who would have magical specials on network TV in the late 80s, I think. And they were pretty amazing. But you can't help but think when you're watching magic on a TV, and this is why you have to go and see it done in person with your own eyes. If you're watching it on TV, that could just be special effects. I mean, what's the difference between a special effect and a magic thing? Well, one is an illusion perpetrated by real people in front of you. The other is a manipulation by computers and tricky filmmakers. Both kind of awesome, but still in this realm of fantasy magic. There are other types of magic. One that I think is important is mentalism. Now, what is a mentalist? A mentalist is someone who uses their supposed mind powers to read your mind or discern things they couldn't possibly know. In reality, and I have a couple of friends that do this, they're using very specific techniques that are often mathematical to guess numbers and whatnot and figure things out. They're also using a lot of social psychology and behaviorism to ask a question and watch how your body twitches in a certain way. Like I had a friend who could guess, I never really got the trick, but he'd learned it from another mentalist, where he could go around the room and guess everybody's favorite number, like with ease. And it was just astounding how he did it. And I always asked him how, and he said, I just watched their faces. And he said something about different facial tics when they thought of their number would give it away to him. Or that could have been misdirection on its own. He might have had some other scam or scheme on it. So mentalism are sort of authentically fake psychics. They're not psychics who are going to try to bilk you out of money to communicate with the dead, but they will guess your PIN number. I watched one guy do it, and he wrote it down and he handed it to the other guy. The guy looked and he went like that, and he said, you might want to change that as soon as you get out of here. On the other hand, it's magic. So that could be a trick. It might have said that he might have handed him a piece of paper that said, act surprised. Who knows? That's the fun of it. I don't want to know. I like things being unknown. Okay. Harry Houdini was probably the most famous magician of all time, stage magician. He was known to be an escape artist. You can see him escaping hung over a bridge from a straitjacket, all sorts of locks and whatnot. What happened was he was really deft at like putting keys in his mouth, and some of the locks that people would inspect had like special doors on them so that he could get out of these various locks. But he upped his game and would be like, all right, I got to get out of these 15 locks, but I'm underwater and I'll drown if I don't do it very fast. So I think Houdini is really fascinating. What's interesting is that toward the end of his life, actually toward his late life, he died quite young. He became really interested in spiritualism, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And he went around and was a skeptic. He didn't believe that people could communicate with the dead. And he went to all of these spiritualists and attended their seances, and he figured them all out every time exactly how they were making the rappings, the knockings supposedly coming from the ghosts, or the levitations where he would find the way they were manipulating they would manipulate things with like invisible wires and whatnot. He caught them all, but he always believed it might be possible. So his goal in being a skeptic was to find someone that could literally connect him to the dead people that he loved. And he wanted that. And he was perfectly happy to go around and debunk anybody who made that attempt. All right, what is spiritualism? This is just like a little sidetrack here. So when you're writing in classes, first off, in religious studies, the word spiritual means very little. Like inspiration, to have breath into. A spirit is a breathed thing. Spirit means very little. Spirituality means very little. People say, oh, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious, but then they can never really define what spiritual means. We'll get into that more as the class progresses. So when you're writing along in a class in religious studies, when you're talking about religion, don't call it spiritualism. I even caught a big scholar calling a mystical experience of a giant monk he was talking about. He called it spiritualism. And I'm like, oh, hold on, wait a minute. He's having a seance? He's up in upstate New York with the Fox sisters? And he was like, oh, I meant something else. And I'm like, yeah, just be careful on that. Okay, so what is spiritualism? It is, in fact, a religious movement that got going in sort of like 1849 with two women who were the Fox sisters. I think they were in their 20s at the time, who began to be able to contact the dead. They would sit people in a circle, calling it a seance. From French words, it just means kind of sit down. And they would call to the dead, and the dead would communicate by knocking sounds, like various, and the table would vibrate, which is pretty easy to do with your elbows. And they did all sorts of this stuff that made people convinced that they were able to communicate with the dead, and they would become spirit mediums. They would be sort of possessed, in fact, by these spirits, and would speak as the spirits. And of course, people thought it was great. And all sorts of other things started to happen. Like they saw ectoplasm. So ectoplasm, you can see a picture of it here on the left. I often think a lot of these are hoaxes, but they are fascinating to me. So ectoplasm is supposed to be like a psychic energy that becomes somehow real and floats in the air and might have images, but often just looks like wispy craziness. There's been there were a bunch of great horror movies in the 1970s that depicted ectoplasm and seances. These days, you might have heard of ectoplasm as the slime from Ghostbusters, but that word does come from somewhere. And in fact, Dan Aykroyd, one of the writers and one of the main actors in the original Ghostbusters, is himself a longtime paranormal thinker, paranormal researcher, more on the truth side than the skeptic side. So when he was drawing from that to write the screenplay, he was really thinking in this occult spiritualist world. Okay, so the Fox sisters admitted right at the end of their lives that the knocks were made by them cracking their knuckles and that they were bopping their feet up and down to make the table vibrate and whatnot. But they were wildly popular. And a lot of people came to them, and a lot of people got something out of it. Intriguingly, we find that someone like Abraham Lincoln was very interested in spiritualism because of deaths in his family that really traumatized him. So he was a bit of a skeptic, but also somewhat of a believer in the ability to communicate with the dead through these seances, through these groups. So the spiritualists together would form a spiritualist church, some of which still exist. I was just reading a wonderful article by a colleague of mine about a spiritualist church in southern central Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio. So it's still going on to some degree, not as much. It's a big cultural thing. Anytime you see people sit around in a room with their hands together on a table in the dark and start talking to the dead, that's spiritualism. Now,